As the dust of war settled over Europe in 1945, the once vital machinery of battle, tanks, planes, trucks, and weapons, was left behind in staggering quantities. Once symbols of military might, they now sat abandoned across fields and military bases, useless in a world no longer at war. What became of these colossal machines, built for victory, now obsolete? The task of dismantling, scrapping, or repurposing them was no small feat. With economies shattered and resources scarce, the Allies faced the monumental challenge of dealing with this surplus of military equipment, creating a post-war landscape marked by both destruction and waste. At the war's end in 1945, Europe was a continent in tatters. The bloodshed, the ruined cities, and the overwhelming number of lives lost left behind not just physical destruction, but a legacy of equipment, massive, costly, and in many cases, still functional. Amid the rubble and the bitter aftertaste of years of combat, an unsettling question loomed large. What would happen to the vast quantities of military equipment, vehicles, and supplies left behind by the Allies? By the time of the armistice, the Allies had amassed extraordinary stockpiles. The sheer scale was staggering: tens of thousands of tanks, trucks, aircraft, jeeps, and weapons. Much of this equipment had been designed for an entirely different kind of war, a war that was no longer being fought. By 1945, much of it was surplus, obsolete, or simply not needed. But its disposal wasn't a straightforward task. With a continent still recovering, logistical challenges stretched far beyond simply organizing the remnants of a military campaign. Europe's economy was in tatters. Nations were impoverished, and resources were scarce. The massive infrastructure and manpower required to dismantle, repurpose, or store all this war machinery simply didn't exist. In the months immediately following the surrender of Nazi Germany, and as the war with Japan lingered into the summer of 1945, Allied leaders found themselves facing a new reality. The machinery that had won the war was now a burden. Countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, and France had armies ready to go, but not the capacity to sustain them at full strength, nor the ability to manage such an overwhelming surplus of military material. The initial response to this glut was a mixture of pragmatism and sheer necessity. Some equipment was immediately returned to the United States and Britain, stored for potential future needs. But the situation was far from simple. The sheer cost of transportation, maintenance, and storage made it impractical for large-scale retention. After years of wartime production, economies were on the brink of collapse. In this context, many of the war machines were abandoned, forgotten, or scrapped. For every tank or airplane that was carefully preserved, hundreds more were left to deteriorate in the open. The American military, for instance, found itself facing a daunting task. Thousands of vehicles were left scattered across Europe, from the bombed-out streets of Berlin to the coastal bunkers of France. Many were left in the open fields, destined to rust into the earth. The U.S. Army's own estimates show that by the end of 1945, nearly half of its equipment in Europe was either obsolete or unsustainable. The government did not have the funds to bring it back, nor the need for it in peacetime. Entire fleets of vehicles were abandoned at military bases. Some were left behind to be scavenged for spare parts, while others simply rotted in place. In Britain, the scene was no different. The Royal Army had been overextended throughout the war, and with the collapse of Nazi Germany, they found themselves with far more than they could manage. Large quantities of vehicles, guns, and aircraft littered airfields and depots across the country. Factories that had once churned out military vehicles now sat idle, unable to shift to peacetime production fast enough. And even when they did, there was little demand for the kinds of war machines that had been forged in the crucible of conflict. With domestic resources stretched thin, the British government had little choice but to begin selling or scrapping much of what had been left behind. Some of this equipment found its way to former colonies, where it was either repurposed or discarded in turn. The dismantling process wasn't solely a matter of scrapping, it was also an exercise in repurposing. This was especially true for certain high-demand equipment. For instance, the American-made Jeep, a ubiquitous and beloved wartime vehicle, found a second life in civilian contexts. In post-war France, they became part of the rural landscape, used for farming and transport, while other military vehicles found their way into civilian industries as makeshift trucks or even construction equipment. But for the most part, the fate of the war machines was grim. The sheer numbers involved meant that even the most efficient repurposing efforts were often overwhelmed. The aftermath of the war also saw the rise of a complex logistical and economic struggle over the disposal of war material. Many countries faced pressure from both political and economic fronts to minimize the burden of surplus military equipment. The cost of storing it, maintaining it, and keeping it functional was far too great. A significant portion of the surplus was sold off in fire sales to smaller nations that could not afford brand new equipment. Others were simply scrapped for their metal value. In some cases, entire fleets of aircraft or tanks were destroyed by bulldozers and left to rot, not due to lack of capability, but because their sheer volume could not be managed. To understand the scale of this, consider the United States alone. By the time the war ended, it had produced 300,000 military vehicles, over 20,000 aircraft, and tens of thousands of weapons. Of these, a significant portion was considered too costly to transport back across the ocean to American shores. The American government faced a difficult choice: keep them stored at considerable cost, or dismantle them for scrap. While some equipment was saved for future conflicts, much of it was simply abandoned, either left in Europe or destroyed in large-scale scrapping operations. In 1946 alone, over 15,000 tanks were discarded or sold off. Meanwhile, in the Soviet-controlled regions of Eastern Europe, the situation was no different. In fact, the Soviets' approach to surplus military equipment was often even more brutal. Much of the German military equipment left behind in the wake of the Red Army's advance, tanks, trucks, and artillery, was either scrapped on the spot or stripped for usable parts. The Soviet government had little interest in preserving these machines, seeing them as symbols of the previous regime's failure. Instead, Soviet efforts were focused on rebuilding their own war machine, often at the expense of salvaging the German spoils. This early post-war period was one of waste, uncertainty, and sometimes grim practicality. The legacy of the war was visible not only in the bombed-out cities and shattered economies, but in the unceremonious fates of the machinery that had helped win it. To many, it seemed like a tragic waste: enormous quantities of advanced technology and hardware abandoned to rust, sold for scrap, or left to be forgotten in the windswept fields of a devastated continent. Yet, this was the harsh reality of a world trying to rebuild itself. The focus was not on preserving the war machines, but on establishing peace, rebuilding economies, and avoiding the catastrophic cost of maintaining an unsustainable military presence. Even as these machines were dismantled, abandoned, or sold off, the scars of the war, the immensity of the task at hand, and the uncertainty of the post-war world cast a long shadow over Europe. But it wasn't just Europe that was left with the aftermath. The Allied powers, too, faced the consequences of their wartime decisions. The fate of the surplus equipment was only one piece of the broader struggle for recovery, but it was one that would continue to unfold for years to come. After the immediate post-war years, the fate of Allied war equipment left in Europe continued to evolve, often with dramatic consequences that shaped the future of both military and civilian industries. By the end of the 1940s, the overwhelming pressure of economic instability, logistical difficulties, and the mounting need for peace consolidation led to the continuation of the hasty, brutal dismantling of thousands of vehicles, weapons, and aircraft that were once deemed essential for victory. The sheer scale of the surplus continued to baffle decision-makers in every Allied country. In Britain, for example, the government had initially hoped to maintain a sizable military force, but the fiscal realities soon became unavoidable. The country, still reeling from the war's enormous costs, was barely able to keep its own economy afloat. The civilian infrastructure had suffered severely during the conflict, and now, in the years immediately following the war, the machinery of war stood as a stark reminder of the resources that had been diverted to military production. The British Ministry of Defence began to dismantle vast quantities of tanks, trucks, and aircraft. This process wasn't as simple as just scrapping equipment. Rather, the vehicles and machines were often systematically broken down to recover parts that could either be reused or repurposed. The bulk of this surplus equipment found its way into the scrap metal market. For example, the well-known British Army Sherman tanks, which had been vital to the success of the Allied forces, became one of the largest groups of war machinery sacrificed to the scrap heap. Thousands of these tanks were sold for their metal value, contributing significantly to the reconstruction of post-war industries. The cost of storing and maintaining the tanks was prohibitively high, and their future as part of the British arsenal was no longer viable in the long term. But it wasn't just about the scrap metal. The British government realized that it could not continue to stockpile such equipment indefinitely without risking financial disaster. They sold off enormous quantities to nations that had not been directly involved in the conflict, many of which were newly independent states that sought to build their own military forces with the surplus. While some vehicles like the Jeep and smaller trucks found new lives in civilian industries, the overwhelming majority were dismantled for parts, either to be sold or used for more immediate wartime needs elsewhere. The British were not alone in this policy. The American and French governments, also facing the financial burdens of post-war recovery, embarked on similar efforts to get rid of surplus war machinery as quickly as possible. The United States, with its vast stockpiles of vehicles, airplanes, and other equipment, took a different approach. By the late 1940s, large portions of the military equipment were no longer needed. The production facilities that had once turned out armaments in record numbers were now turning out civilian goods in response to the pressing needs of the American public. As the U.S. began to demobilize, the surplus of war machines was sold off or scrapped in extraordinary quantities. In some cases, U.S. military surplus was auctioned to foreign nations, including those in Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, which were eager to build their own military capabilities, often on limited budgets. The sale of military vehicles and equipment to smaller, less developed nations became a significant source of revenue for the American government, but it also created a vast global network of second-hand war machines that would continue to affect international relations for decades. In the U.S., the situation was more controlled, but no less massive. According to one report from 1948, over 20,000 tanks had been disposed of in Europe alone, either sold to foreign countries or dismantled for parts. The need for such vehicles had diminished dramatically as the focus shifted from wartime to rebuilding. Aircraft, too, met a similar fate. Thousands of warplanes, from the famous P-51 Mustangs to the bombers that had been instrumental in defeating Nazi Germany, were left to rot on airfields, many abandoned without ceremony in the open fields of Europe. Some were stripped of usable parts before being left to rust, while others were simply discarded in massive fields near military bases. For example, the boneyards of the American military, where vast numbers of retired aircraft were stored, became repositories of war machines that would never see another mission. Over time, many of these planes were sold or dismantled for parts, and some were even given away to various organizations or governments. The quantity was so overwhelming that the process of managing them became an afterthought. It wasn't just military vehicles that were abandoned or repurposed. Entire military bases and infrastructure were left behind as well. In France, Britain, and Germany, large numbers of military bases were quickly abandoned by the Allies after the war. Entire complexes of barracks, storage depots, airfields, and tank parks sat unused, gathering dust as the military rapidly downsized. Some of these bases were repurposed by newly established governments for their own uses. But most were left as hollow monuments to the scale of the war and the speed with which it had ended. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's approach to the disposal of war equipment was far more ruthless. As the Red Army advanced through Eastern Europe, it systematically stripped entire factories of any equipment that could be useful. Tanks, trucks, and other vehicles captured from the Germans were often cannibalized for parts, and in some cases, entire production lines were moved to the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union's attitude towards military surplus was less about recycling and more about eliminating the remnants of the enemy's war machine. While the Soviets salvaged some equipment, much of what they encountered was either destroyed or left to deteriorate in the harsh conditions of Eastern Europe. The war machines left behind in the aftermath of the Soviet push into Germany, Poland, and Hungary became a graveyard for obsolete or unnecessary military hardware. Even German weapon systems, those that had been captured or left behind by the retreating Nazi forces, were often dismantled or simply left to rust in the fields. In addition to the mass destruction of war equipment, there was also the matter of the vast industrial infrastructure that had been built during the war. Factories that had once been devoted to producing tanks, planes, and weapons were often shut down or repurposed for peacetime manufacturing. In some cases, the infrastructure of these factories was simply abandoned, while in others, they were converted into civilian production sites. The vast network of military-industrial complexes that had fed the war machine across Europe now found itself in the uncomfortable position of being unnecessary. The transition from wartime production to civilian production wasn't seamless. The shift to peacetime industries left many workers displaced, and many factories struggled to find a new purpose. The economic burden of these industries, once the lifeblood of wartime economies, added to the already staggering costs of war recovery. The scrapping of war equipment continued into the 1950s, but the slow pace of the post-war economy meant that many machines remained in Europe for years, untouched. Abandoned tanks, jeeps, and artillery pieces became part of the landscape in rural parts of France and Germany. In some areas, local farmers would use military vehicles for hauling goods or even as makeshift homes. But for the most part, the war machines that had been integral to victory became symbols of obsolescence. Their once proud engines, designed for the destruction of the enemy, now served only as reminders of a time that had passed.